If we consider film as a mode of communication between filmmakers and the audience, as we implicitly do when we cite theories that use pseudo-linguistic terminology or when we refer to such things as filmic language, then what happens when a film momentarily utilizes a diegetically spoken language that is unknown to the audience? What meanings do audiences take from filmic dialogue in languages to which the film consciously denies them full access? This question is, generally speaking, what motivates my research, in which I specifically look at how popular Anglophone cinema utilizes non-English languages. So far, I've found that the kinds of meanings audiences are encouraged to take are primarily influenced by genre. German dialogue in a Hollywood comedy film will be presented and interpreted entirely differently than German dialogue in a Hollywood war film, for example. For this presentation, I wanted to look at the generic base case, how non-English languages are depicted in the most Hollywood of all genres, the classical Western, taking as a case study the use of Native American languages in John Ford's landmark 1956 film, The Searchers. Classic Westerns might seem at first to be a strange place to seek out non-English languages, since they largely take place within the domestic borders of the United States. That, however, is exactly the point, since these films thematize the domestication of the expanding country in terms of land and language. More specifically, I argue that classic Westerns like The Searchers symbolically erase and denigrate Native American languages through the alternating use of such techniques as diegetic and metadiegetic silencing, the conflation of Native Americans and their speech with animal noises, and the representation of Native American speech as meaningless and inarticulate. Together, these primitivist dehumanizing techniques have shaped generations of cinemagoers' perceptions of Native Americans and their languages as being inherently less developed than American English and its native speakers. In turn, these basic representational techniques have often been borrowed from the Western and redeployed whenever Hollywood films seek techniques to make us view another people group as less developed. The first technique The Searchers uses to negate Native American languages is through the basic directorial decision to withhold dialogue from such characters, to keep them, for the most part, taciturnly silent. This is reliably seen in the first visual introduction of Native American characters in almost every scene in which they appear. For example, the first scene of The Searchers, which features a Native American character, is when Ethan's brother's homestead is assailed by a Comanche raiding party. Towards the end of the scene, we see Debbie hiding in front of her grandmother's grave. The shadow of a man slowly rises over her, and we cut to a close-up of the Comanche chief, Scar, gazing silently upon Debbie before blowing his horn to signal the beginning of the raid. Some 10 minutes later, we are treated to another scene showing the Comanches. A band of vengeful homesteaders are pursuing the Comanche raiders when, suddenly, the homesteaders see a lone Comanche scout mount an adjacent ridge. The Comanche scout again gazes silently for a while before making a hand gesture to summon the rest of the Comanche raiding party, led by Scar. We get a close-up of the silent, watchful Scar, as well as the same of a group of older Comanche warriors. While the homesteaders are allowed to babble, panicking and arguing about what to do, the whole group of Comanches simply stalk them silently from afar. Such introductions recur throughout the film, where Native American characters are routinely either introduced as mute or dead. In this respect, the film's representation of Native Americans incorporates elements of mutism described by Michel Chion in his 1999 text, The Voice in Cinema, as the refusal to speak. Chion notes that the mute character occupies an undefined position in space, so that he might emerge from off-screen at any moment. It is as if not being tied down to a voice gives him a sort of angelic or diabolical ubiquity. One might find him anywhere without knowing how he got there. Presumed to have virtually unlimited knowledge and vision, and maybe even unlimited power, in some, potentially omniscient, panoptic, and omnipotent, the limits of his powers are never clearly determined. In corroboration, the Comanche characters indeed seem to appear out of thin air, and in the former scene, when Scar looks blankly upon the defenseless Debbie, the audience is left to guess at his intentions. The specter of violence, especially sexual violence, looms large in the audience's inferences of his unspoken intentions. Indeed, much of the rest of the film is spent trying to ascertain whether Debbie is still even alive. By virtue of their silence, therefore, the Comanches in The Searchers adopt this inherently destabilizing and threatening nature. In scenes where Native American characters appear, but where they are not treated with such explicit animosity, a different silencing technique is used. About an hour into the film, there is a scene where Martin Pauly, Ethan's traveling companion, is shown trading goods with a different tribe of Comanches. This scene, showing mutual and cooperative dialogue between Martin and the Comanches, however, is presented as a flashback through the distanciating framing device of a letter Martin wrote to his sweetheart Laurie about the events. The soundtrack at the beginning of this scene, therefore, consists only of Laurie's voice reading out Martin's letter, thereby narrating the events shown on screen. Martin and the Comanches' dialogue, the only scene showing cooperative intercultural dialogue, is deliberately muted, proscribed from the soundtrack. The oral viewpoint of the soundtrack only transfers back to the events depicted on screen exactly when Ethan and Martin are no longer welcome in the Comanche camp, when mutual cooperation reverts back to the default overarching hostility. Even then, when we are given the oral possibility of hearing the Comanches speak, they remain mute, letting their body language and rifles do the talking. Although the Comanches are shown on screen as mostly being mute, the situation is entirely different when they are off screen. Native American characters in classic westerns like The Searchers are, indeed, at their most communicative when off screen. Shion observes that this is a common trope for mute characters, whose implicitly threatening omniscience means that the mute, the body without a voice, displays many attributes of his counterpart, the voice without a body, the acousmatic voice, the voice of one we do not see. Shion defines the acousmatic character, the acousmetre, as being neither inside nor outside the image. It is not inside because the image of the voice's source, the body, the mouth, is not included, nor is it outside since it is not clearly positioned off-screen in an imaginary wing, like a master of ceremonies or a witness, and it is implicated in the action, constantly about to be a part of it. The Native American characters distinctly bear the hallmarks of such acousmatic characters, and thereby also are imbued with the acousmetre's threateningly ambiguous liminal location. This is most obvious again in the first scene featuring Native American characters, when Scar's raiding party are besieging the Edwards homestead. Let's go back to the beginning of the scene, long before we see Scar's aforementioned climactic entrance. It's twilight, and the Edwards, Ethan the father, Martha the wife, and their children Lucy, Ben, and Debbie, are preparing the evening supper. Over ominous strings, we hear coyote howls in the distance, which draw Aaron's attention. In a reverse shot, we see, from Aaron's point of view, a flock of birds startled into flight from behind a sagebrush. Sensing something amiss, the Edwards dog starts barking into the darkness, and Aaron loads his rifle. In another reverse shot of the darkness from Aaron's point of view, we see a metallic glint in the distance, accompanied by more coyote howls. Next, and closer this time, we hear some bird calls, but by now we strongly suspect that the bird calls are a signal used by the Comanches as they creep closer. The realization of their imminent murder leads Lucy, in one of the most affecting moments of the film, to let out a blood-curdling scream. When Scar enters the scene, it is merely a visual confirmation of our acoustical fears. In this scene, the Comanche's presence is clearly and systematically implied through oral, non-visual means, the coyote howls and the bird calls, before their presence is established through Scar's visual entrance. It is as if the environment, and the fauna in particular, is the acousmatic voice of the Comanches. Indeed, throughout the entire film, we never hear off-screen animal noises without it implying the threatening, impending presence of the Comanches. As Ethan says in a later scene in a swamp, surrounded by the din of crickets and frog ribbits, and a pair of curiously human bird calls that make the men cock their rifles.
Sure, I was here. And now they're out there, waiting to jump us.
The film, therefore, enforces quite a strict dichotomy on the Comanches. While unseen, they are acousmatic, at their most communicative when they are on the verge of visibility. Once they become visible, though, they are rendered more or less mute, non-communicative, at least until the shooting starts, as we will see later. The Comanches in The Searchers, though, are different from the other acousmeters analyzed by Shion, in that Shion's case studies are all verbal, whereas the Comanches are merely vocal. That is, Shion's acousmeters all speak words, whereas the Comanche's acousmatic communication is contained only to noises, and not just any noises. The Comanches are scrupulously associated with specifically animal noises: frog ribbits, cricket chirps, coyote howls, and bird whistles. This conflation of Native Americans with nature, especially threatening elements of nature, is as old as it is primitivist and racist. The film explicitly reasserts this tradition in a conversation between Ethan and Martin, where Martin exclaims that,
"They gotta stop sometime. If they're human men at all, they gotta stop."
To which Ethan replies,
No, human rides a horse until it dies, then he goes on afoot. Comanche comes along, gets that horse up, rides him 20 more miles, then eats him.
thereby simultaneously positioning the Comanches as non-human and as having an animalistic fellowship with nature. With respect to language, Michael Cronin notes that there is a long philosophical tradition from Descartes to Chomsky conflating linguistic capacity with humanness. If language differentiates the animal from the human, he argues, then denying the utterances of others the status of language that can be translated is to reduce them to the condition of animals. This formula is clearly at play in The Searchers. The Comanches are in almost all contexts denied the use of their own language, and in its place, they are given either silence or implicitly dehumanizing animal calls. The film's rejection of the Comanche's linguistic capacity reaches its feverish climax, however, when the Comanches are shown attacking. The first such instance follows directly on from the aforementioned case of when we first visually see the whole group of Comanches. That is, when the band of vengeful homesteaders find themselves suddenly flanked on both sides by two groups of silent mounted Comanches. The homesteaders decide to make a dash over a nearby river to safety, and when they break from their tense trot to a full-blown sprint, the scene's comparative silence is shattered. The soundtrack swells, the cymbals crashing, brass bellowing, and strings breaking into a glissando and ending on a high trill. Gunfire soon erupts, crowding the soundtrack further. Meanwhile, as the Comanches gallop to give chase, the film has them begin yapping and hollering in the fashion that is characteristic of classical westerns. While this at first seems to be a battle cry, and thus could be rationalized as an attempt at realism, this assumption is belied by the fact that over the rest of the 4-minute sequence, the Comanches are shown making the same absurd vocalization irrespective of whether they're attacking, being shot down, or being routed. Especially in the long shots from across the river of the Comanches haphazardly retreating in defeat, their continued yapping makes them seem like a startled flock of gobbling turkeys, lending them yet another air of savage, unbridled animality. One of the characters even mocks the Comanches' noises by doing the common yet patently racist hand-over-mouth ululation falsely associated with Native Americans. In a perfect straw man argument, the film constructs the Comanches' vocalizations as absurd and savage, and subsequently ridicules them for their forced representation. This construction of the Comanches' language as being akin to asemic noise is made even more explicitly in a later scene when, in the course of their search for Debbie, Ethan and Martin come across a cavalry outpost harboring a number of other white women who had been abducted by the Comanches. Ethan and Martin request to see the women to check if Debbie is amongst them. In the course of doing so, we see what has become of the women's linguistic capacity. As a result of their long captivity with the Comanches, the women are senseless and childlike. They can no longer speak English, nor Comanche for that matter. The women no longer even passively understand English, as we see when they ignore Martin's repeated request that they stand up. In a chilling reverberation of Lucy's aforementioned scream, brought on by her fear of the Comanches, these women merely scream, giggle, make senseless noises, or remain silent, while the cavalry captain remarks that
it's hard to believe they're white.
Ethan responds by disowning them from their very racial identity.
They ain't white anymore. They're Comanche.
Being Comanche, therefore, is concomitant with the lack of sensible linguistic capacity. Towards the end of the film, there is a climactic confrontation between the two main adversaries, Ethan and Scar. After Scar speaks some English to Ethan, he sardonically remarks,
You speak pretty good American for a Comanche. Someone teach you?
to which a minute later, Scar retorts,
You speak good Comanche. Someone teach you?
This begs the question, though, of what it means within the film to speak Comanche. As I have argued, speaking Comanche means, in most instances, remaining silent, of possessing no meaningful language. When you are present in a scene but not visible, speaking Comanche means making coded bird whistles, blurring the distinction between human and animal. When, finally, you are allowed to be seen making noise, you do not produce language so much as yap, scream, and hollow wildly. This collection of representational techniques is not only present in the searchers, but forms the standard suite of options available for the vast majority of classic Westerns in how they choose to represent Native American languages. This dehumanizingly primitivist tradition, it goes without saying, is both a manifestation of and significant contribution to the continuing legacy of linguistic racism directed towards America's first peoples. Despite its origins in classical Westerns, though, these particular techniques of linguistic racism are of wider interest to us because they have found their way into countless films from other genres, principally neo-colonialist films depicting the global South, since, as Shohat and Stam note, for the colonizer, to be human is to speak his language. Colonialist films, they argue, associate the colonized with hysterical screams, non-articulate cries, the yelping of animal-like creatures, the sounds themselves placing beast and native on the same level, not just neighbors, but species equals.